Welcome back to Lumon Industries. Viewers, it's easy to get severed from your own memories of what happened last season. But don't worry, we're here to refresh your Nai and Autai minds with a detailed recap of Season 1. Mark Scout, who works in Lumon Industries' Macrodata Refinement MDR division, discovers he is being promoted to department head in light of coworker Petey's sudden departure. His first task is to orientate Helly, the replacement, who wakes up in a conference room with no memory of who or where she is. After being given an orientation and learning her name, she demands and is allowed to leave, but finds she is unable to do so. She then sees a video explaining that she has undergone the Severance procedure, which split her memories to create a version of herself that will only exist inside the workplace. The outside version of Mark, a former professor grieving his wife's death and living in the Lumen-subsidized town of Kier, encounters a man claiming to be Petey who gives him a letter with cryptic instructions. Mark returns home and interacts with his neighbor Mrs. Selvig, unaware that she is his boss, Senior Manager Harmony Coble. The previous day, Helly undergoes the severance procedure as a new employee, implanting a microchip inside her brain. At the office, the severed Helly is introduced to her new co-workers, Dylan and Irving, and is instructed that her job is to sort encrypted numbers into digital bins as part of macrodata refinement. During a welcome party headed by floor manager Milchick, Helly becomes uncomfortable and attempts to escape by writing her outside self, or Autai, a note of resignation, but the elevator shuts down. Mark claims this is due to Lumon's built-in code detectors, which prevent unauthorized communication between selves. Mark claims responsibility and is put into the break room as punishment. Later, Irving hallucinates a black liquid covering his desk and is administered a wellness check, where counselor Miss Casey recites various vague facts about Irving's Autai, with Irving forced to react neutrally. At the wellness center, Irving also meets Bert, the head of the two-person optics and design department. Outside, Mark once again meets with Petey, who explains that he has reintegration sickness from reversing his severance. Petey tells Mark of the break room and plays a recording of himself repeatedly reading out a stringent apology, with Milchick forcing him to repeat the lines. Mark gives Petey shelter in his house. As he is taking a shower, Petey suffers hallucinations and collapses. Petey tells Mark that mysterious benefactors helped him undergo the reintegration procedure. While Mark is at work, his sister Devon and brother-in-law Rickon deliver a book authored by the latter to his doorstep, which Mrs. Selvig steals and takes to Lumon to check for hidden messages. As she searches Mark's house, Petey recognizes her as Coble and flees the house, suffering more hallucinations and eventually collapsing at a convenience store. At the office, Helly learns her resignation request sent to her Autai has been denied. Mark thwarts her various attempts to smuggle other messages to her Autai. To help Helly understand why she is working at Lumon, Irving suggests they show her the office's perpetuity wing, which documents the history of Lumon's founder, Kier Egan, and his succeeding dynasty. After attempting another escape, Helly is brought to the break room, where Milchick forces her to repeatedly recite an apologetic passage. After his shift, Mark follows ambulance traffic to the convenience store and witnesses Petey being carried away by paramedics after his breathing stops. Mark rushes home to hide evidence of Petey's stay, but is interrupted when Petey's abandoned cell phone rings. The next day, Irving visits optics and design, where he grows closer to Bert and discovers Rickon's book left behind by Milchick during Helly's attempted escape. Mark decides to keep the book despite promising to give it to management. Helly returns from the break room after being forced to read her apology over 1,000 times. She finds a paper cutter and threatens Coble with self-mutilation unless she is granted a recorded resignation request. However, her Autai sends back a recording firmly denying the request. Coble attends the funeral as Mrs. Selvig and extracts Petey's severance chip prior to his cremation. She then has Miss Casey perform a special wellness session on Mark, which she watches remotely. Casey has Mark sculpt his emotional state out of clay. Mark sculpts a tree, which is Autai visited in remembrance of his late wife Gemma after the funeral. Irving discovers that O&D actually has at least 7 employees working in a massive unlabeled back room. Dylan finds Rickon's book hidden in Mark's files. Helly smuggles out an extension cord and hangs herself in an elevator shaft. Helly is injured by her suicide attempt, but ultimately survives. She returns to work 3 days later. Mark continues to read Rickon's book, which carries strong anti-establishment sentiments. Outside work, Devon gives birth. When Helly returns, Coble orders Miss Casey to watch her closely, but Mark sneaks Helly out of MDR and reveals he has been recreating Petey's map. Helly agrees to help Mark with recreating the map after they discover a previously unknown department in which a single employee feeds baby goats. Bert admits to Irving and Dylan that he lied about the size of O&D due to MDR being seen as untrustworthy. They realize Lumon is pitting the departments against one another. Bert takes the two to O&D's back room and introduces them to his employees. Lumon Security Chief Doug Grainer calls Coble to inform her he has identified ex-employee Rigabi as the one responsible for Petey's reintegration. Irving and Bert admit their feelings to one another, but the former admits he is not ready to commit to a relationship. After learning Miss Casey was sent to the break room for failing to watch him and Helly, Mark has Irving introduce MDR to O&D, where he calls for the departments to work together to uncover Lumon's secrets. However, Milchick finds them and sends Mark to the break room. Milchick later briefly awakens Dylan's and Nye inside his Altai's home to locate a card Dylan stole from O&D, leading Dylan's and Nye to discover he has a son. Devon meets Gabby, a woman she met at the birthing lodge, but Gabby does not recognize her. Devon later learns Gabby's husband, Angelo Arteta, is a Lumen-backed state senator who supports legalizing severance. Coble, as Mrs. Selvig, gets close to Devon and Rickon by acting as their lactation consultant. Mark goes on a date with Alexa, Devon's midwife, to a concert by Petey's daughter's punk rock band and sings along to an anti-Lumen protest song. Later, Mark finally answers Petey's phone and is contacted by Rigabi to meet in person at a nearby university. While Mark is meeting with Rigabi, Grainer enters the building following a tip from campus security and tells Mark he works with him. Rigabi kills Grainer and gives Mark his access card, telling him to bring it to his Nye. Devon tells Coble, posing as Mrs. Selvig, that she suspects Gabby severed her memories to avoid the pains of childbirth. Milchick engages in a music dance experience with the department as a prize for Helly. Dylan refuses to participate and eventually attacks Milchick, enraged that he cannot know any more information about his child. Dylan tells the department about Lumon's ability to wake them up outside the severed floor, known as the overtime contingency. Mark and Helly scheme to find the security office. Inside, they find Lumon strictly monitors all of its employees, and that the overtime contingency is activated using two levers. Dylan offers to stay behind after hours to wake Mark and Helly up on the outside. Irving departs to O&D, worried about Bert's safety. Upon arrival, he discovers that Bert is retiring and openly berates the non-severed Milchick for exploiting the severed employees. After work, Alexa visits a drunken Mark, who scares her off after ripping up a photo of Gemma. After she leaves, Mark reassembles the photo, revealing it to be of Miss Casey. Irving's Altai is shown to be living alone in an apartment, where he spends much of his time painting identical images of a dark corridor. Helly reaches 100% on her data refinement file, thereby meeting MDR's quota for the quarter. Coble schedules Mark for a final wellness session with Miss Casey and appears disappointed when Mark and Miss Casey fail to remember each other as husband and wife. She then orders Miss Casey sent back down to the testing floor, whose entrance is shown to be the same corridor in Irving's paintings. While MDR celebrates quota, Coble is suspended by the board for withholding knowledge of Helly's suicide attempt and her extracurricular activities as Mrs. Selvig. The MDR team prepares for Dylan to remotely awaken them on the outside. Helly kisses Mark before departing. Mark's Altai attends Rickon's book reading party and tells Mrs. Selvig that he plans to quit Lumon. She encourages him to do so. Dylan receives a waffle party as a reward for meeting quota, in which he dons a Keir Egan head and sits within a replica of Keir's bedroom in the Perpetuity Wing, while ritualistic and seductive dances are performed in front of him. Dylan leaves midway to access the security office and activates the overtime contingency to awaken Mark, Irving, and Helly's innies in the outside world. Mark's Nye awakens in Devon's home and finds himself hugging Coble. While excusing himself to find Devon, he calls Coble by name, alerting her that the overtime contingency has been activated. Coble calls Milchick and has him check the security office. Mark privately reveals to Devon that he is in Nye form. Devon tells him of Gemma's death and learns that Mrs. Selvig is Mark's boss. Devon encourages Mark to report Lumon's misdeeds to the press, as Lumon likely controls the police. Irving wakes up in his apartment, discovering his Altai's paintings and background in the U.S. Navy, and finds a map and employee directory in the closet, which he uses to locate Bert. Helly wakes up at a Lumon gala where she learns that her outai is Helena Egan, daughter of Lumon CEO Jane Egan, who underwent severance to build public support for legalizing the procedure. Coble races to the gala and attempts to stop Helly from making a scheduled speech. Milchick reaches the security office and cuts his way through the makeshift restraints Dylan has placed on the door. Helly gets on stage and tells the crowd of the innie's subjugation and torment. Irving arrives at Bert's house only to find he is already in a relationship. Mark finds a photo confirming Miss Casey to be Gemma. He rushes to tell Devon, but is only able to say, "She's alive," before Milchick tackles Dylan, deactivating the overtime contingency and reverting the three to their outai state. What a mind-blowing season. Who else is still trying to piece together all the clues? Let me know your theories in the comments below. And don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more Severance content.